June 1944. Saipan. The rain came sideways, hammering the canvas roof of the field hospital like rifle fire against tin. Inside, beneath the low hum of a diesel generator and the wet stench of iodine, a man's eyelids fluttered open. He did not know yet that he was alive, nor that the hands gripping his shoulders belonged to his enemy. Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, 28 years old, 43rd Infantry Regiment, Imperial Japanese Army, had last remembered the heat of an explosion, the metallic taste of sand and blood, and the weight of duty that demanded death before capture. Now, the first thing he saw was the pale light of a lantern and the glint of a syringe being drawn by an American medic. The soundscape was strange. English murmurs, boots squeaking on mud-slick boards, the soft rip of gauze unspooling. Every few seconds came the snap of gloves and the crisp click of metal trays. Kenji's gaze darted upward. White bandages, morphine bottles, the orderly motion of strangers tending to him. A soldier with a Red Cross armband leaned close, muttering something about shrapnel near the femur and no pulse left in the right hand. None of it made sense. In his mind, Americans were monsters, men who burned villages, desecrated the emperor's will, laughed at death. Yet here, one pressed a damp cloth to his forehead and said softly, "Easy, buddy. You're safe now." Through the thin hospital walls, the island still burned. The rumble of distant artillery mixed with the steady rain. Somewhere outside, stretcher-bearers moved past the flapping tents, their boots slapping puddles as they carried both friend and foe alike into the triage line. For every scream that pierced the night, there was the counterpoint of a calm voice. An American nurse giving quiet orders to hold pressure, check vitals, keep him breathing. Kenji tried to speak, to say, "Yamato Damashi, the soul of Japan," but the words collapsed into a cough. The nurse lifted his head and held a cup to his lips. Water. Cool, clean, endless water. For a moment, the war receded. The only sound was the rain, the gauze, the heartbeat that refused to stop. He stared at the ceiling, realizing with slow horror and awe that his life now belonged to the enemy's mercy. Before we move deeper into this forgotten story, subscribe to POW Tales, where real history speaks. Beyond the flickering lanterns of Saipan's field hospitals, a vast system of mercy had already begun to take shape across the Pacific, and within it, the story of how healing became the strangest form of surrender. By late 1944, the Pacific had become a geography of ruins. Coral atolls scorched to white ash, jungles hollowed by flame, and islands whose names now existed mainly as hospital reports. Behind the headlines, a quieter front had opened, one that almost no soldier expected: the war of medical ethics. Between the battles of Saipan, Leyte, and Okinawa, thousands of wounded Japanese soldiers, once told that surrender was worse than death, were captured alive. Many were near skeletal, dehydrated, delirious, with gangrene. The U.S. Army Medical Department, under the Geneva Convention of 1929, ordered that these men be treated without distinction of nationality. And so began an extraordinary experiment: the care of the enemy. The Pacific POW system operated differently from its European counterpart. Where the U.S. Army had processed over 400,000 Germans through orderly camps in the American Midwest, the Pacific's captives trickled in from ravaged islands, men often too weak to stand, brought on stretchers to makeshift hospitals under palm leaves and tarpaulins. By December 1944, nearly 14,000 Japanese prisoners were in U.S. custody across the Pacific Theater, scattered through base hospitals in Guam, New Guinea, the Philippines, and on American hospital ships. These were not men expecting compassion. Their training had been absolute. Surrender was dishonor. Capture meant torture. Yet what awaited them was antiseptic, not bayonet. A 1945 War Department memorandum, preserved in the National Archives, outlined the medical policy in plain terms. Japanese prisoners will receive medical and surgical care equivalent to that afforded to our own wounded. Beneath those words lay a logistical miracle. Mountains of supplies shipped from California depots, crates of penicillin, sulfur drugs, quinine, plasma units, splints, and sterile linens. The U.S. Army Surgeon General's office calculated that by mid-1945, each Pacific POW hospital consumed enough morphine and plasma per month to match a stateside civilian facility serving 10,000 people. Abundance was not just a symbol of America's industrial reach, it was a moral statement. Still, for the men behind the barbed wire, abundance felt like hallucination. We could not believe they would give medicine to enemies, one former prisoner wrote, decades later in his memoir notes from Guam Hospital No. 2. The doctor said the drug was called penicillin. I thought he was lying, for I had heard that even our best surgeons at home had little of it. His disbelief was echoed in interrogation transcripts and Red Cross interviews, where captured soldiers expressed confusion that their wounds were not exploited for experimentation. Some even begged for death, ashamed of having been spared. In Michigan, 10,000 miles away, Detroit's industrial abundance had astonished German POWs, but in the Pacific, the shock was moral as much as material. The contrast between American excess and Japanese deprivation carried a deeper implication. Mercy could function as propaganda. War Department public information officers quietly photographed the treatments, sending images to Allied newspapers showing doctors tending Japanese wounded. Yet the same images, if ever seen in Tokyo, would have been labeled treason. In his post-war memoirs, Colonel James L. Gillespie, a medical corps commander in the Marianas, recalled an encounter with a Japanese officer whose legs had been amputated after an artillery blast. He would not eat, Gillespie wrote. He said a soldier without legs is useless. When we brought him broth, he turned away. Only when our nurse sat beside him, spoon in hand, did he finally accept it. Later, he bowed to her. It was the first time he had bowed to an enemy. From the beginning, these wards functioned as fragile laboratories of humanity. American nurses, many from civilian hospitals, found themselves stitching shut wounds beneath the gaze of men who once swore to kill them. Some of those nurses wrote home that the Japanese prisoners were so young, almost boys, while others confessed unease at offering kindness to men from Batan's armies. Each act of care pressed against the boundaries of vengeance. In those humid, canvas-sheltered rooms, medicine became the only language that crossed cultures. To clean a wound was to tell the prisoner that he still belonged to the human world. To change a bandage was to challenge the very premise of total war. By early 1945, the American policy of humane treatment for enemy wounded had evolved from principle into a calculated tool of reconstruction. Washington's War Department began circulating directives that described medical aid not merely as duty, but as strategy. Declassified memoranda from the Office of War Information reveal a striking shift in tone. The captured Japanese soldier, treated well and exposed to American efficiency, becomes the seed of post-war understanding. That sentence, penned in March 1945, marked the moment when care became communication, when healing, paradoxically, became propaganda. This ideological transformation did not happen in an office alone. It emerged from the field, where doctors and medics discovered that survival itself could alter belief. At a field hospital on Guam, Lieutenant Robert Kessler, a 26-year-old surgeon from Kansas City, noted in his log that a wounded Japanese corporal, having seen the stores of plasma and penicillin, began to weep and ask why his own army had not cared for him thus. For Kessler and his colleagues, that reaction validated something larger, the power of abundance as persuasion. Behind the tents, ships from San Francisco arrived with their metal bellies full of supplies. Each crate bore stenciled markings. Medical Department, U.S. Army, Pacific Area. Inside were sealed glass ampules of morphine, rolls of cotton dressings, chloroform, sulfur powder, and surgical steel gleaming like silver. Japanese prisoners watched as medics unpacked these materials, their disbelief tinged with humiliation. One interpreter reported that several prisoners whispered, "The Americans have more medicine than we have bullets." In that phrase lived the entire paradox of the Pacific War, an empire of scarcity meeting a democracy of plenty. War Department policy officers understood the psychological weight of that moment. The re-education program that had begun in the European POW camps, films, lectures, and work details took a subtler form here. Instead of classrooms, there were infirmaries. Instead of textbooks, bandages. The lesson was implicit. An enemy who heals you cannot be wholly evil. In a circular dated May 1945, the Surgeon General's office outlined cultural exposure opportunities for recovering Japanese POWs, suggesting that those deemed cooperative might be allowed to observe American hospital procedures. The reasoning was twofold. First, to provide practical instruction that could later serve in rebuilding Japan's shattered medical infrastructure. Second, to let the prisoners see the scale of American logistical mastery. Some officers questioned this policy, fearing it might breed resentment. Others insisted it would plant the seeds of respect. Letters from POWs confirm how deeply this experience unsettled them. One recovered soldier from Leyte, writing under censorship to his family, described the bright rooms full of medicines and bottles where the nurses move like spirits of mercy. Another told of a moment when an American medic wrapped his infected hand, saying, "You'll be fine soon." The prisoner wrote, "I felt I had been defeated not by guns, but by kindness." Such testimonies, quietly archived in Red Cross correspondence files, reveal the dawning realization among Japanese prisoners that America's true weapon was not its bombers, but its abundance. That abundance was almost incomprehensible. U.S. Army inventories show that Pacific hospitals consumed more than 2 million individual bandages and dressings in a single quarter of 1945. In comparison, Japanese frontline units often rationed one roll of gauze among 20 wounded men. The symbolism was devastating. To a culture that equated sacrifice with honor, to be saved by the enemy's surplus felt like moral inversion. The bandage, once a mark of weakness, now became a quiet revelation. As the war dragged into its final desperate months, this gulf between ideology and reality deepened. Some American doctors noticed their patients beginning to ask timid questions about life in the United States, about democracy, about whether all Americans were so generous. Many did not yet understand that they were part of a larger narrative, a rehearsal for the humanitarian reconstruction soon to unfold across occupied Japan. The final American offensive in the Pacific would expose thousands more to this paradox of healing. And for men like Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, that confrontation between belief and mercy would mark the start of an internal collapse far greater than any military defeat. The descent began not with bullets, but with a bandage tied by a steady foreign hand. August 1944. The air above Saipan still smelled of cordite and decay. Inside the convalescent ward, the humidity clung like fever. Sergeant Kenji Nakamura lay on a cot near the entrance, watching rainwater drip through a tear in the canvas. His wounds had begun to knit under layers of gauze and penicillin dressings. Each morning, the nurse replaced the bandage with almost ceremonial precision, scissors glinting, antiseptic stinging, a quick, firm wrap of white. She spoke in a language he could not understand, but the tone was unmistakable, calm, unhurried, human. Yet the calm was unbearable. In the Japanese military code, capture had erased one's honor. A living prisoner was a ghost, his name stricken, his family instructed to mourn. Each new sunrise was not grace, but shame. The other Japanese prisoners in the ward shared that silence, eyes downcast, breaths shallow, as if to avoid offending their American caretakers. Some refused food for days, believing starvation more dignified than recovery. But the Americans persisted, coaxing, sometimes forcing, nourishment through the stubborn wall of pride. At night, when the nurses dimmed the lanterns, Kenji could hear the island breathing, the ocean sighing beyond the reef, the buzz of insects over open wounds, the distant generators thrumming like mechanical hearts. His mind replayed the final battle, the cries of comrades, the shouted banzai, the explosion that buried him in sand. He remembered the lieutenant's final command, "No surrender." That phrase haunted him more than his pain. He began to fixate on the bandage. Every morning, when the nurse unwrapped it, he saw the faint red stain where his blood had met American cotton. It felt obscene, enemy fabric touching sacred flesh. Yet as the days passed, he noticed how clean it became, how the wound shrank, how his fever faded. The bandage began to mean something else, survival. But survival itself was betrayal. The Americans spoke little of ideology. They had no need to preach. Their abundance did the talking. Kenji watched crates of supplies arrive daily, medics replacing syringes as casually as one might replace a pen. To him, it seemed impossible, a civilization so wealthy it could afford mercy. In his mind, the phrase repeated, "They heal even their enemies." Once, during a wound inspection, the American surgeon, tall, sunburned, with spectacles fogged by heat, paused and met his gaze. "You'll walk again," he said, through an interpreter. Kenji did not answer, but when the doctor turned away, Kenji's eyes filled with tears he refused to acknowledge. Days merged into weeks. A faint smell of disinfectant clung to everything, mingling with the sweet rot of tropical fruit. The medics moved like clockwork. Clean, efficient, polite, even to men who would have slit their throats a month earlier. Among the prisoners, rumors spread that the Americans used the treatments as experiments, that the bandages hid some secret toxin. But as no one died, suspicion eroded into reluctant gratitude. In the adjacent cot, a younger soldier named Tadao whispered one night, "Maybe they are saving us for their gods." Kenji did not respond. He turned to the wall, tracing the seam of the canvas where light leaked in, thinking of home, of his mother's hands, calloused from washing rice, of his father's stern face, reciting the emperor's name. He wondered what they would think if they saw him now, wrapped in the enemy's cloth, alive because of the enemy's medicine. The bandage became a mirror, forcing him to see the fracture between his upbringing and his reality. Beneath its layers, the infection receded, but within him, another sickness grew: doubt. Outside, the jungle pulsed with life, indifferent to war. Cicadas droned as if nothing had changed. But inside the ward, something irreversible was beginning: the slow collapse of belief. The fever broke on the 10th night. Kenji woke to a silence so profound he thought he had gone deaf. No rain, no groans, only the dim shuffle of boots on gravel outside. The nurse, whose name he finally learned was Corporal Bennett, leaned over his cot and checked his pulse. Her touch was light, mechanical, yet strangely tender. "Better," she said, through a grin that needed no translation. Then she peeled away the bandage, and for the first time, he saw the wound clean. Pink, new, alive. The sight filled him with terror. His flesh, reborn by the enemy's mercy, looked alien. It was the color of shame. He turned his face away and muttered, "Yamet, stop." Bennett hesitated, then rewrapped the wound, slower this time, as though she understood. In that gesture, cloth meeting skin, silence meeting silence, something ancient cracked inside him. Across the ward, another prisoner screamed in his sleep. The sound tore through the fragile calm, reminding everyone that the war had not ended beyond these walls. Each man's nightmare was the same: returning home as an outcast, condemned for the sin of survival. They had been told their deaths would sanctify the empire. Yet here, under enemy care, their lives were preserved against their will. A week later, the American surgeon allowed Kenji to sit up. His legs trembled as he swung them over the cot. The nurse steadied him, her arm cool against his fevered skin. Outside the tent flap, the sunlight was blinding. He squinted toward the lagoon. Turquoise water, distant wrecks of Japanese landing craft half submerged, seagulls circling like ghosts. For the first time, he smelled the sea without the stench of cordite. It felt like betrayal. That night, he dreamed of his old unit, men charging with bayonets into the sea, shouting for the emperor. He woke, drenched in sweat, the bandage clinging to him like a second skin. He tore at it in panic until the nurse rushed over, stopping his hand. "You'll bleed," she warned. But he only whispered, "I must not live." She froze, realizing she was holding a man whose culture had no word for mercy. Slowly, she guided his hand back down and said, "Then live for them." The next morning, when she changed his bandage again, he did not resist. He even met her eyes, if only for a moment. The color of her irises, gray like the overcast sea, reminded him of the horizon he used to watch from the gun pits. Something within him shifted imperceptibly, like sand settling after a storm. The routine of recovery became a rhythm. Dressing changes, broth, rest. The repetition dulled his resistance, as if the body's will to heal was stronger than the mind's devotion to ideology. Yet the more his body mended, the more the weight of contradiction grew. In the evenings, the ward filled with the faint music of a field radio, swing tunes drifting through static. The melody was foreign but strangely comforting. For a few seconds, it made the world feel human again. Then came the moment that sealed his confusion. A U.S. officer entered the ward, distributing cigarettes to the walking wounded. When he reached Kenji's cot, he offered one word, peace, and extended a pack of Lucky Strikes. Kenji hesitated, then took it. The cigarette was smooth, the paper dry and sweet on his lips. Smoke curled upward, tracing invisible threads between two worlds that had once sworn to annihilate each other. That single gesture, an enemy's cigarette shared over a healing wound, broke the last certainty within him. From that point, the bandage ceased to be a reminder of humiliation. It became something else entirely, a fragile truce, proof that even amid ruin, there was still a pulse of compassion. Beyond the tents, new orders awaited. Some of the recovered prisoners were to be transferred to permanent camps, places with fences, rations, and time enough for reflection. For Kenji, the descent was no longer physical, but spiritual, a slow fall into the unknown terrain of conscience. The road to those camps would lead him into routine, the monotony of survival and the quiet rituals that began to bind strangers into men again. By September 1944, the war had receded from Saipan's beaches, leaving behind its survivors, both the living and the half-dead. The convalescent wards were emptied in stages, and the transport-fit prisoners, as the U.S. Army Medical Corps classified them, were sent to semi-permanent camps. For Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, that meant a journey inland to a newly built compound on Guam. Rows of Quonset huts, cyclone fences, and whitewashed signs that read POW Camp No. 12, Medical Section. The first morning inside those fences was eerily quiet. There were no gunshots, no shouting, only the rhythmic thump of hammers as American engineers finished the infirmary annex. Kenji and 50 others were assigned to the hospital wing, partly because of their injuries, partly to keep them under watch. They slept on canvas cots, arranged in straight lines, their days ruled not by battle orders, but by routine. Wake up at 600, breakfast rations at 700, dressing change at 0900. Even in captivity, the rhythm of survival demanded precision. Each day began the same way. The clatter of tin trays, the sharp scent of carbolic acid, the sound of nurses' footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. Kenji learned to anticipate the pattern of care, the unrolling of gauze, the faint hiss of alcohol swabs, the tug of tape against skin. The nurses moved briskly, efficient, yet kind. Some spoke fragments of Japanese, others relied on smiles and gestures. Over time, those gestures became a kind of language, an unspoken grammar of mercy. Outside the infirmary, life was simpler but harsher. The uninjured prisoners labored under guard, clearing debris, unloading supply trucks, tending vegetable plots that fed the camp. To them, the men inside the infirmary seemed both envied and cursed, envied for their shelter, cursed for their dependence. Among the healthy, Bushido still whispered that the wounded should have died with honor. Among the wounded, silence was their shield. The American staff worked with mechanical steadiness. They logged temperatures, tracked pulse rates, tallied doses. Yet sometimes, amid the paperwork, small moments of humanity slipped through. A nurse humming softly as she stitched a wound. A medic teaching a curious prisoner how to sterilize instruments. These were not grand acts, but they stitched together the days. Kenji began to notice the smaller details, the white tiles of the infirmary gleaming beneath fluorescent lamps, the way the nurses rolled their sleeves neatly before cleaning a wound, the way the air smelled faintly of soap, not smoke. The rhythm of care became hypnotic. The war outside, the bombings of the Philippines, the fall of Leyte seemed impossibly distant. Here, life was measured not in victories, but in heartbeats. In the evenings, when the heat finally broke, the medics sometimes left the ward doors open, letting in the scent of salt and grass. Kenji and the other patients would watch the sky fade from gold to deep violet through the wire fences. Once he saw a group of American soldiers tossing a baseball near the mess hall, their laughter echoing over the compound. The sound was strange, free, unburdened. He realized he had not heard laughter without fear in years. Inside, one nurse, Private Ellen Ward, often stopped to check his charts. She was young, no older than 20, her hair tied back beneath a sweat-stained cap. One evening, she noticed Kenji staring at the fading bruise along his arm and said slowly, "You're healing." He didn't understand the words, but her expression made the meaning plain. That night, he dreamed not of battle, but of his village's river, the same one he'd played beside as a child. The following week, the American doctor assigned Kenji to light duty within the infirmary. He was to help clean instruments and fold linens, a small privilege meant to speed reintegration. At first, he worked stiffly, ashamed. But as the days passed, the motion of folding white cloth after white cloth soothed him. The act of order of aligning corners, smoothing edges, reminded him that even in captivity, dignity could exist in precision. Outside, the jungle pressed against the wire, wild and restless. Inside, order reigned, antiseptic, structured, alive. In that contrast, the bandage motif deepened. Mercy as method, healing as habit. Weeks turned into months, and the once chaotic rhythm of the infirmary solidified into something almost sacred. The POWs no longer flinched when the doors clanged open or when the guards' boots echoed down the concrete walk. There was order now, sterile, predictable, strangely comforting. For men who had lived by the roar of artillery, the whisper of medical brushes in disinfectant bowls felt like a new kind of prayer. Each morning began with inspection. Kenji would help prepare the rows of instruments. Forceps, scalpels, scissors, clamps. He polished them with lint-free cloths until they reflected the overhead bulbs. Across the room, the American nurses checked bandage stock, their hands moving with ritual precision. There was something almost reverent in the way they laid out gauze, as though each roll carried the memory of a wound they meant to undo. When the truck from the central supply depot arrived, Kenji would pause in awe. The crates seemed endless, stacked with bandages, morphine ampules, antiseptic bottles, rubber gloves, even toothbrushes. He thought of Japan, where hospitals on the home islands were rationing sutures and reusing gauze until it dissolved. In the Pacific front lines, he had seen surgeons patch men with rice paper soaked in iodine because cotton was gone. Yet here, in an American camp, the abundance seemed infinite. The abundance changed the prisoners in ways subtle and deep. At first, some had mocked the Americans' waste, throwing away bandages after a single use, discarding empty vials that might have been refilled. But gradually, disbelief turned to reflection. They began to ask quiet questions. How could a nation produce such quantities? What kind of industry, what kind of will, made this possible? Letters later, intercepted by the War Department's censorship office, reveal fragments of their wonder. One POW wrote, "Even their medicine is made by machines. The doctor does not fear shortage. He heals as though the earth will always give him more." Another, from a captured ensign, confessed, I did not know mercy could be organized. These notes, filed under Psychological Reports, Pacific Detainment Units, 1944, hint at how the rhythm of routine was not merely physical, it was ideological. Kenji's duties expanded slowly. He was allowed to assist with the sterilizer, a humming steel cabinet that hissed and vented clouds of hot air. The nurses taught him to handle instruments with tongs, to load and unload trays. Each time the sterilizer door opened, a wave of warmth brushed his face, mingling with the faint metallic tang of iodine and boiled cloth. He realized, without understanding why, that this machine symbolized something vast, the mechanical repetition of care, as systematic as war itself, but born of a different purpose. In the mess hall, meals followed the same clockwork precision. Tin trays lined up, ladles dipped, guards counted heads. Even food seemed abundant: beans, bread, fruit, meat on occasion. The prisoners' bodies filled out. Their faces, once hollow, regained human form. The American staff noted this with clinical satisfaction, yet beneath that surface, something more profound stirred: the erosion of the myth that had sustained them through the empire's rise, that America was soft, decadent, unworthy of endurance. At night, when the lanterns dimmed, Kenji sometimes lay awake, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the other patients, the soft wheeze of one man's chest wound, the faint rustle of sheets. All sounded like proof that life could persist without command or conquest. For the first time, he imagined survival not as victory, but as continuation. On Sundays, Chaplain Robert McKay visited the ward. He never preached. Instead, he asked the prisoners if they wished to write letters home. Few dared, but Kenji once accepted. With borrowed ink and a rough pencil, he wrote to his younger brother in Hiroshima, "I am alive. The Americans do not strike us. Their medicine is stronger than fear." The letter, translated and censored, was later archived by the Office of War Information, another small testament to quiet astonishment. The days blended, indistinguishable, yet oddly luminous. Even the sound of rain on the Quonset roof became part of the camp's rhythm, soft percussion to accompany the routine of recovery. One evening, as he wiped down a tray of instruments, Kenji noticed that his reflection in the steel had changed. The man staring back no longer looked like a soldier or a captive. He looked like someone in between, a witness to mercy's machinery. That night, as a nurse turned off the lights and whispered, "Good night," Kenji whispered back the same word in Japanese, "Oyasumi." It was the first time he had spoken softly in months. The next morning, the camp received unexpected orders. A group of recovered POWs, including Kenji, were to be relocated to a mainland facility for further interrogation and study. The guards called it Operation Understanding. To Kenji, it sounded like exile into a world even more mysterious than the one behind the wire. The trucks arrived before dawn. The sound of engines broke the familiar rhythm. The nurses packed medical kits. The prisoners packed nothing. As the convoy rolled out past the medical tents, Kenji glanced back at the white bandages fluttering on the laundry line, like flags of a strange new peace. The road ahead led toward the turning point, January 1945. The Pacific winds carried a damp chill across the transport decks of the Liberty ship USS Dinsmore as it churned towards San Francisco. Below deck, in the dim-lit hold converted for passengers, Kenji Nakamura sat with 40 other convalescent prisoners. Their hands were clean, their uniforms replaced with plain khaki-marked PW. Each carried a paper tag stamped "Medical Case non-combatant. Above them, the ship's physician moved between bunks, checking charts clipped to the rails. The air smelled faintly of oil and disinfectant, the two scents that had come to define captivity. The journey was slow, 10 days across an indifferent ocean. At night, Kenji could hear the steady throb of the engines, an endless pulse that reminded him of the sterilizer's hum in the Guam infirmary. The same mechanical certainty, the same rhythm of motion and purpose. Once, he had believed machines existed only to kill. Now, he understood they could heal, sustain, even carry men toward understanding. That realization unsettled him. It felt like disloyalty, not to his captors, but to everything he had been taught to believe about them. When the ship docked, fog shrouded the harbor, and the first thing the prisoners saw was the skyline. Cranes, smokestacks, warehouses stacked against a pale gray sky. The city loomed vast and silent, yet alive with movement. Trucks rumbled, sirens echoed, dock workers shouted orders. To Kenji, it was like watching an organism breathe. They were driven inland by military convoy to a camp in California's Central Valley, designated Camp McCallum. Here, their new role was defined, subjects of the War Department's Cultural and Reorientation Program, designed to expose Japanese prisoners to American society, and, through that exposure, erode the foundations of imperial militarism. Camp McCallum was no ordinary facility. Behind its barbed wire stood classrooms, workshops, and a fully equipped medical training hall. The guards spoke less harshly. The Red Cross visited often. The Americans wanted these prisoners to see, to witness, the moral architecture of the society they had fought. For most of the men, this was bewildering. For Kenji, still nursing a healing shoulder wound, it was terrifying in its generosity. One morning, after the first snowfall of the year, the prisoners were told they would be touring a nearby military hospital. The convoy of green trucks set off down Highway 99, past fields gleaming with frost, until the complex of white buildings appeared on the horizon. Fresno Army Hospital. As they entered, the sight was overwhelming. Corridors stretching endlessly, every room gleaming, supply carts loaded with equipment. Rows of cabinets filled with glass ampules, shelves stacked with gauze and antibiotics. The Americans moved through these halls like orchestra conductors, every gesture efficient, every sound precise. Nurses pushed gurneys past operating rooms, humming with sterilizers and suction pumps. Patients, soldiers from Anzio, Normandy, the Philippines, lay swaddled in crisp linens. Kenji followed the group silently, his eyes absorbing every detail. He noticed the color-coded charts clipped to beds, the constant movement of supply clerks replacing bottles, the faint mechanical sigh of ventilators. At one point, a U.S. surgeon noticed his stare. "Never seen one of these?" the man asked gently, resting a hand on the gleaming autoclave beside him. The interpreter translated. Kenji hesitated, then shook his head. The doctor smiled faintly and said, "This is how we keep men alive." Those words stayed with him. How we keep men alive. In his world, the purpose of medicine had always been to return soldiers to battle. Here, it seemed the purpose was simply to return them to life. That difference, subtle, philosophical, felt like a door swinging open in his mind. Later that day, the prisoners were guided through the supply warehouse. The scale was staggering. Crates labeled Medical Department, U.S. Army, sterile dressings, morphine, plasma units, surgical instruments. Forklifts moved constantly, stacking boxes higher than men could reach. In the corner stood a massive poster showing an assembly line of women in white coats packing bandages. The caption read, "Every hand saves a life." Kenji stared at it for a long time. He had seen propaganda before, but this felt different. It was not about glory or sacrifice. It was about care multiplied by industry. It made him realize that mercy itself could be mass-produced. That night, back in camp, he could not sleep. The image of the poster hovered behind his eyes. He thought of the nurse in Guam, of the sterilizer's hiss, of the rhythmic folding of linens. He realized all those small acts were parts of the same machine, a system vast enough to turn compassion into a collective enterprise. In his bunk, he whispered a single word to himself: Ikiru, to live. Not as duty, not as survival, but as choice. It was the first time he had thought that word without shame. The next morning, orders came down from the camp commandant. A group of medical POWs would be transferred east to see America's industrial core firsthand. Detroit, the heart of production. Kenji's name was on the list. The turning point had begun to move again, this time on steel rails toward the unseen machinery of mercy. The train that carried them east in February 1945 was long and heavy, its cars filled not with soldiers, but with former enemies. Outside, the American landscape unfolded in slow motion, vast, indifferent, abundant. Orchards gave way to desert, desert to plains, plains to cities lined with steel rails and telephone poles stretching into forever. For Kenji, every mile was a revelation. He pressed his face to the window, watching towns glide by, schools, gas stations, families in winter coats, walking without fear. The war he had known seemed distant and absurd here, as though it belonged to another planet. By the time the train reached Chicago, snow clung to the platform roofs, and the prisoner's breath turned to frost. From there, another rail took them north toward Michigan. The guards grew less vigilant. They no longer saw these men as threats, but as witnesses. Each POW carried a small notebook provided by the War Department, stamped Educational Tour, Rehabilitation Unit. Inside the cover, a simple message read, Observe, learn, reflect. The Detroit skyline rose out of the haze like a promise of order. Smokestacks pulsed against the winter sky, their columns merging with the clouds. The air smelled of metal, oil, and life. Trucks thundered along Jefferson Avenue, their trailers filled with crates stamped Ford Motor Company and War Production Board. The convoy of buses carrying the POWs turned toward the River Rouge plant, one of the largest industrial complexes in the world. Inside, the roar was unlike anything Kenji had ever experienced. Conveyor belts rattled, pistons slammed, welders' sparks cascaded in blue arcs. The scale was staggering, a city within a city. But what stunned him most was not the machinery of war. It was the parallel line running beside it. Crates of medical supplies, surgical tools, sterilizers, splints, all moving with equal precision down the same lines that produced tanks and trucks. An American engineer, guiding the group, pointed upward, shouting over the din. Every fourth line runs medical. Bandages, braces, sterilizers, built just like engines. The interpreter repeated it, but the prisoners had already understood. They watched as a team of women in white overalls assembled surgical kits with the same synchronized rhythm as the men riveting engine plates. Efficiency had become compassion made visible. Kenji stood frozen near one of the conveyor belts, mesmerized by the gleaming trays of stainless steel instruments passing by. Forceps, clamps, scissors, the same tools he had cleaned by hand in Guam were now being stamped, polished, and packaged by the thousands each hour. A single factory could produce more medical equipment in a day than Japan could have in months. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. It wasn't just about resources, it was about philosophy. America had built an empire not of conquest, but of supply. That evening in the officers' lounge, the POWs were offered coffee, hot, bitter, strong. They sat quietly, too overwhelmed to speak. One of the American interpreters, a Nisei linguist named Lieutenant Tanaka, noticed their silence. "You've seen how they make medicine," he said softly. "Do you understand now why they never run out of mercy?" Kenji didn't answer. He stared into his coffee, watching the steam rise in perfect spirals. Mercy, he thought, was a resource, but only if a nation chose to make it one. Later that night, the group was taken to a warehouse adjoining the Rouge complex, where finished medical supplies were being crated for shipment to Pacific bases. Kenji noticed a familiar symbol stenciled on the side of a crate, a red cross over white paint. Beneath it, in black letters, the words "To Guam Hospital Unit 3. He froze. That was the very place he had been treated months earlier. The crate before him, untouched, unshipped, contained the same tools and dressings that had once saved his life. He reached out, hesitated, then rested his hand lightly on the wooden surface. In that moment, the loop closed. The machinery of mercy had connected both sides of the war. The nurse's hand, the doctor's scalpel, the line worker's wrench, all part of one system that defied hatred. When the prisoners were herded back to the buses, Kenji looked once more at the towering factory behind them. The smokestacks no longer seemed like instruments of war. They looked instead like the lungs of a living nation, breathing out care in industrial rhythm. As the convoy rolled toward the barracks for the night, snow began to fall, silent, slow, dissolving into the warmth of the city lights. Inside the bus, Kenji closed his eyes and thought of that crate bound for Guam. Somewhere, another wounded soldier, maybe American, maybe Japanese, would live because of what he had just seen. The moment marked the end of ignorance and the beginning of something fragile and new. The turning point gave way to the collapse and liberation. April 1945. The world itself seemed to tremble as the Pacific War neared its end. Rumors filtered into every POW camp. Whispers of Okinawa burning, of Tokyo bombings, of Germany collapsing in ruins. Inside the Michigan facility that housed Kenji Nakamura and the other medical-class prisoners, the air grew thick with uncertainty. Guards moved with a weariness that felt new, as though they too sensed history shifting beneath their boots. Kenji had changed. He was no longer the skeletal man who had stumbled out of the Saipan jungles months before. His posture had straightened, his face filled out, his English improving through exchanges with the American nurses assigned to the camp infirmary. Yet a quiet fear gnawed at him, that this fragile balance of order and mercy would vanish the moment the war officially ended. What would happen then to men like him, caught between defeat and gratitude? The camp commandant, Colonel Raymond Bishop, gathered the prisoners one grey morning. "Japan's empire is falling," he said, through the interpreter, "but the war is not over yet. We expect you to conduct yourselves with dignity until repatriation." His tone was formal, But behind the words lay something else: relief. He knew these men were no longer soldiers. They had become something closer to students, observers of another civilization's moral machinery. As spring warmed the barracks, American staff allowed more freedoms. The POWs tended vegetable plots, repaired fencing, and assisted in the infirmary's daily routines. Kenji spent most of his time cleaning instruments and filing medical forms, habits that had become second nature. One afternoon, while unpacking a shipment of supplies, he noticed a familiar label on a box: Detroit Medical Division, Shipment Num. 54. Inside were the same surgical kits he had seen assembled weeks earlier at River Rouge. He smiled faintly. The machinery of mercy was still running even as empires died. Yet outside the wire, the world was unraveling. News of the atomic bombings had not yet come, but the air carried a tension that spoke of endings. Some of the older prisoners whispered that Japan's honor was lost, that surrender would be worse than annihilation. Others, like Kenji, felt a strange calm, as though survival itself had become the only form of honor left. On May 7, 1945, when Germany surrendered, the American camp erupted in celebration. Music played from the loudspeakers, guards cheered, flags were raised. For the prisoners, it was a day of quiet reflection. They watched the jubilation with unreadable expressions. One German POW, housed in an adjacent section of the camp, shouted in English, "It's over for us," and laughed. The Japanese section remained silent. For them, the storm had not yet passed. That night, Kenji sat by the infirmary window, listening to the faint echo of a harmonica, played by an American soldier somewhere outside. The melody was slow, mournful, a lullaby for the dead. He thought of his comrades who had never left the islands, of the surgeon who had wrapped his shoulder in bandages made from torn uniforms. And then he thought of the nurse in Guam, of the way she had said, "You're healing." Perhaps he thought healing was the only true victory left. Days later, the first official bulletin reached the camp. Japan was negotiating surrender terms. There would be no last stand, no glorious annihilation. The emperor himself had spoken of peace. The guards' demeanor softened further. The electric tension that had defined every interaction began to dissipate. American officers encouraged the POWs to write home, promising that Red Cross ships would soon carry them east. When word of the atomic bombings finally arrived, Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, silence fell like ash. Kenji's pencil slipped from his hand as the interpreter read the news aloud. The word Hiroshima struck like a physical blow. His younger brother, the one he had written to from Guam, lived there. The silence that followed was unbearable. The guards said nothing. Even they seemed unable to comprehend what mercy and power looked like when fused into one act. For days afterward, the camp became subdued. Some prisoners prayed, others refused food. Kenji moved through his routines as if underwater, his mind blank, his body mechanical. The abundance of the American warehouses, the infinite supplies, the humming factories, all now seemed part of a vast contradiction. The same civilization that could heal a broken shoulder could also erase a city in a flash of light. And yet, when the official word of surrender came on August 15, 1945, he wept, not from pride, not from shame, but from the release of tension he had carried for 3 years. The war had ended, and he was still alive. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri, Japan signed its surrender. In Michigan, the prisoners gathered in the rec hall to hear the news broadcast over a crackling radio. Outside, the trees were turning gold. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and soap. Mercy and devastation now coexisted in the same breath. Repatriation began quietly. There were no parades, no music this time, only trains, lists, and ships waiting to carry men back to countries that no longer existed as they remembered them. At Camp McCallum, the medical POWs were among the last to leave. Their skills had made them valuable to the U.S. Army Medical Corps, and many had served as orderly assistants in the final months of the war. But by autumn 1945, the War Department ordered all Pacific prisoners returned home. The American guards shook their hands before they boarded the transport buses, a small, wordless gesture of respect. Kenji carried only what he had been given: a khaki satchel with his papers, a small medical manual, and a single folded bandage he had kept since Guam, washed, pressed, and rewrapped countless times. To him, it was both relic and reminder, the symbol of how mercy had survived through method. The convoy rolled east toward the port of Seattle, past fields of wheat and empty factories where the machinery of war had finally gone silent. For the first time in years, there was no sound of production, no trains laden with supplies, no sirens, only wind and memory. The ship that would take them across the Pacific was named USS Benevolence, a hospital transport converted for peace. Its decks gleamed with white paint, its red crosses bright under the grey sky. When Kenji stepped aboard, he felt a strange symmetry. The same ocean that had carried him west as an invader now carried him east as a survivor. The sea, indifferent yet eternal, bore witness to his transformation. The voyage home was filled with silence and reflection. Some men spoke of their families, others of guilt. The American medics on board treated the prisoners not as enemies, but as patients. They issued vitamins, checked wounds, and distributed clean clothes. One night, while assisting a medic with bandage inventory, Kenji found himself standing before a cabinet marked U.S. Army Medical Department, Detroit Division. The sight of that word, Detroit, that felt like fate completing its quiet circle. The very tools of healing that had once passed through his hands were now accompanying him home. On the 12th night at sea, he stood on deck, watching the horizon dissolve into darkness. The stars shimmered over the water, and for the first time, he felt no fear of what waited beyond them. Somewhere behind him, America's lights glowed invisible beneath the clouds, a nation that had conquered not through cruelty, but through abundance. Ahead lay Japan, his homeland scarred, defeated, yet waiting. When the ship docked in Yokohama, the air was heavy with smoke and ash. The port was a ruin of twisted cranes and burned warehouses. U.S. occupation forces stood in orderly lines, directing arrivals. The returning POWs stepped ashore into a silence broken only by gulls and the clatter of boots. A medical tent stood nearby, its white fabric stark against the wreckage. Red Cross nurses, some American, some Japanese, waited with stretchers and clipboards. Kenji paused at the tent's entrance. Inside, tables overflowed with medical supplies, clean gauze, new instruments, boxes of penicillin. The labels were printed in both English and Japanese. One nurse handed him a form to fill out, then pressed a small tin of ointment into his palm. It was marked, "Made in USA." He turned it over, running his thumb along the embossed lettering. In that moment, something inside him broke, not in despair, but in recognition. The machinery of mercy had followed him home. Even amid ruin, the principles he had witnessed, precision, abundance, care, had already taken root in the ashes. Weeks later, he was assigned to assist at a reconstruction clinic in Hiroshima Prefecture. The work was relentless: burn victims, malnutrition, infection. But for the first time, he found purpose not in service to an empire, but to life itself. He reused the bandage he had kept from Guam only once more, on a boy no older than 12, his arm seared but salvageable. When the dressing was done, Kenji looked at the fabric and realized its threads were almost gone. The symbol had fulfilled itself. Outside, trucks from the American occupation rolled through the streets, unloading crates of medical aid. On their sides gleamed the same red cross he had seen in Detroit, the mark of a nation that had taught him that compassion could be as organized as war. He no longer feared the machines. He understood now that the hum of engines and the clatter of assembly lines could build more than destruction. They could sustain life if guided by mercy. When the day's work ended, he stepped outside into the dusk, the smell of iodine fading into evening air. The sky over Hiroshima glowed faintly, a city beginning to heal. The collapse had given way to the aftermath. Winter 1946. The wind that rolled through Hiroshima carried the faint scent of cinders and sea. The city had begun to move again, slowly, painfully, but undeniably alive. Wooden scaffolds rose where temples once stood. New streets cut through the ruins like veins through scar tissue. Amid this fragile rebirth, former soldier and now medic Kenji Nakamura walked the same streets he had feared he would never see again. His hands, once used to carry rifles, now carried gauze and thermometers. Each step was both an act of penance and a quiet assertion that to live was to repair. The American occupation had transformed Japan's medical landscape. Field hospitals had become teaching centers. The same manuals Kenji had read in Michigan were now translated and distributed across the country. Supplies arrived weekly from the U.S. Army Medical Corps: bandages, syringes, sulfur powder, vitamins. It was an abundance that both humbled and unsettled him. Every box he opened bore the same mark: Medical Department, U.S. Army, Detroit Division. That word again, Detroit, carried a weight he couldn't explain. It was as if the city itself had become a distant cathedral of mercy, forever supplying the world with lifelines. At the clinic where Kenji worked, the patients came in endless waves: farmers with burns from black market fuel stoves, mothers whose children coughed from the ash that still drifted with the wind. He dressed their wounds carefully, layer upon layer, the same way the nurses had done for him. Each wrapping felt like a prayer for forgiveness, not for his nation alone, but for the century itself. Sometimes at night, he dreamed of the infirmary in Guam, the hiss of sterilizers, the rhythmic footsteps of nurses, the smell of disinfectant and salt. But the dream always shifted into something larger: the River Rouge assembly lines stretching forever, each conveyor carrying instruments of healing. In his sleep, he could hear the machines thrum like a heartbeat. The memory no longer frightened him. It comforted him. In the spring, representatives from the International Red Cross visited the Hiroshima clinics. Among them was an American doctor named Charles Danner, a surgeon who had served in the Pacific and now oversaw humanitarian medical programs. When he met Kenji, he paused, scanning the man's face as if searching for recognition. "Were you in Guam?" he asked through an interpreter. Kenji nodded. "I remember your file," Danner said softly. "Compound fracture, shoulder, healed clean." For a moment, the two men simply looked at one another. Then the doctor smiled faintly and extended his hand. The handshake was firm but not formal, a gesture that dissolved the last invisible wall between enemy and ally. For Kenji, it felt like the true end of the war. That night, as the city settled into darkness, Kenji stood by the half-rebuilt river bridge, watching lanterns float downstream. The people called them Toro Nagashi, lights for the dead. He thought of those he had lost, and of the strange, circuitous path that had carried him here, from a Pacific jungle, through an American infirmary, to a Detroit factory floor, and back to the ashes of home. The machinery of mercy had not only saved his life, it had remade it. He began keeping a notebook again, just as he had during his captivity, but now his entries read like quiet meditations. The Americans did not win through weapons alone. They won because their factories produced compassion faster than we could destroy it. Another line, written months later, read simply, "Mercy is the only empire worth building." The Hiroshima clinic grew busier as more survivors found their way there. The supplies kept coming, and with them, hope began to take physical form, in the weight of sterile gauze, in the clink of glass ampules, in the familiar hum of an electric sterilizer that now ran on Japanese current. Every morning, when Kenji tied his apron and began his rounds, he whispered the same phrase under his breath, half in prayer, half in remembrance. Oyasumi, the word he had once spoken to an American nurse. The war had collapsed, but mercy endured. By 1951, when the Treaty of San Francisco formally ended the occupation, the Japanese medical infrastructure had transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a fractured wartime system, starved, secretive, and hierarchical, now functioned with an efficiency that astonished even visiting European observers. Hospitals stood bright with white-tiled walls and humming electric lights. Pharmacies brimmed with imported penicillin. Training manuals from the U.S. Army Medical Corps, translated into kanji, lined the shelves of Tokyo University's new medical library. Kenji Nakamura walked through one of these hospitals during an international exchange visit, his steps echoing against clean marble floors. The smell of alcohol and iodine felt familiar now, but something else caught his attention: laughter. The young interns joked softly as they prepped syringes and calibrated new X-ray machines. Their confidence reminded him of the American medics who had once tended to him in Guam, how they had worked quickly but never without humor, as if laughter itself were a disinfectant against despair. That realization stayed with him. The idea that healing was not only the stitching of flesh, but the reweaving of spirit. He had seen his countrymen broken not only by wounds, but by silence, the shame of defeat, the weight of unspoken guilt. But medicine required speech, diagnosis, instruction, compassion. To heal, one must first talk. It was this philosophy that Kenji carried into his later work with the Red Cross, helping to train nurses who would later serve in Korea. In 1952, he received a letter from Michigan. The envelope was thin and airmail blue, the handwriting looping and feminine. It was from Nurse Ellen Hardy, the woman who had dressed his wounds in Guam and taught him to hold a scalpel steady. The letter was short, almost hesitant. "I still keep your thank you note, the one you wrote in the infirmary. I often wondered if you made it home. Detroit has changed, but I like to think people still build for peace. If you ever find your way back to America, there's a place for you here." Kenji never traveled back, but he framed the letter and hung it in the hospital training room in Hiroshima, next to a faded American Red Cross poster. It became a quiet relic, proof that compassion could outlast ideology. His students would ask who she was, and he would simply say, "Someone who believed in repair." As the years turned, his notebook filled with reflections drawn not from war, but from its aftermath. One entry from 1960 reads, "The abundance that once shocked me, the endless supplies, the machines, the comfort, was not excess. It was preparation. They built abundance so that mercy could move faster than suffering." He had come to see America not as a conqueror, but as a contradiction, capable of both destruction and salvation, its factories switching effortlessly between bombs and bandages. By the 1970s, the American medical model had been absorbed, adapted, and localized. Japanese pharmaceutical companies now produced their own antibiotics, their own gauze and surgical steel. Yet Kenji never forgot the first time he saw a clean needle glint under Pacific sunlight, nor the sound of that American nurse's voice saying, "Hold still, you'll live." That memory remained his moral compass through decades of reconstruction. In his old age, when journalists came to interview the survivors of the camps, Kenji rarely spoke of the battles. He spoke instead of the smell of antiseptic, the texture of gauze, the sound of typewriters in the Red Cross tents. "War takes everything," he would tell them, "but mercy gives back what war forgets." He died quietly in 1982, surrounded by students who had never seen the war but had inherited its lessons. In the drawer beside his bed lay two objects: a faded American Red Cross armband and a single unopened ampule of penicillin, a relic from that first shipment in 1946. The label had long faded, but the glass still caught the light. After his death, one of his former pupils placed the ampule on display in the Hiroshima Peace Museum. The placard beneath it read simply, "Mercy Manufactured." If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.